So our first speaker is Dr. Ahmed Reja, coming from across the borders and the mountains. He's a good old friend. We meet at a lot of meetings in many different continents and countries. Dr. Ahmed Reja is a consultant medical specialist in internal medicine, diabetes and endocrinology, and he's currently the IDF Africa chair. He works and teaches at the Addis Ababa University, and is honorary president of the Ethiopian Diabetes Association. And he is a very entertaining speaker, so I'm sure you're going to enjoy this, the talk on cardiovascular safety in diabetes.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya, for that long introduction. But you missed, I wish you could have said that I'm a very good friend of many Kenyans. I'm so honored to be here with my old friends, Ahmed, Mohammed Gaman, C.A. Fortiano, Nancy, Dr. Acharya, Paul, and many others. So it's really nice to be here always. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me to talk at this meeting, and for the sponsors, AstraZeneca. It's always good to come to Kenya because we don't need visas, so you can come anytime we want. That's the best thing I like. And the other thing is, besides learning from all of you and sharing whatever I know, I have become envious of KSDG because we don't have one in Ethiopia. So as you know, Kenya and Ethiopia always have healthy competition, particularly in long distance running, which we are taking over from the Kenyans. Anyway, so I'm sure when I go home, I will establish the Ethiopian Diabetes Study Group and learning from what you have done. So, having said that, this is my disclosure and disclaimer. So whatever I'm talking does not necessarily represent the opinions of AstraZeneca. So when we talk about cardiovascular safety in diabetes, I have three objectives. That is to understand the relationship between diabetes and CVD, elucidate the cardiovascular effects of certain anti-hyperglycemic agents, and of course elaborate the cardiovascular outcome trials of newer agents. So that is the outline of my talk. I hope to be very brief. I don't think I need to tell to this August gathering that diabetes is a huge public health problem. We have already heard more than 420 million people are living with diabetes all over the world, with global, it's a global epidemic with health, economic, and psychosocial consequences. And it's a very costly disease. And major burden comes from chronic complications. And among the chronic complications, the one that is most important is the cardiovascular events. Therefore, cardiovascular safety is of paramount importance in diabetes care and management. As you all know, atherosclerotic complications are responsible for 80% of mortality among patients with diabetes, and of these, 75% are accounted due to coronary artery disease. 50% of patients with type 2 diabetes have pre-existing coronary artery disease. And when patients present with MI, a third of them have undiagnosed diabetes. And the chance of survival after acute coronary syndrome is really very low, because there is 50% increase in the rate of death after acute coronary syndrome, and patients with diabetes are prone to have congestive heart failure after acute coronary syndrome. So in general, diabetes increases cardiovascular risk. That is twofold increase in cardiovascular disease and stroke. Therefore, reducing cardiovascular risk is a major focus of diabetes management. And this slide shows the role of postprandial hyperglycemia. Glycemia in itself is, which is a defining feature of type 2 diabetes, is associated with elevated risk, but more so postprandial hyperglycemia is also associated with independently with cardiovascular mortality and myocardial infarction. So when we talk about diabetes and cardiovascular disease, we always think of coronary heart disease, stroke, heart failure, and peripheral arterial disease. So the question I have to the audience is, what is the commonest initial manifestation of cardiovascular disease in patients with type 2 diabetes? Any answers? Any volunteers? Mostly we think of acute myocardial infarction, strokes, and so on. But a recent study from the UK has shown that, in fact, the most common first presentation of CVD were heart failure and peripheral arterial disease. This was a population study of over 34,000 with a median follow-up of 5.3. So now, diabetes in itself causes increased risk for cardiovascular disease, but also certain medications, diabetic medications, could also be harmful to the cardiovascular system. Therefore, the ideal anti-hyperglycemic agent should enable glucose control on one hand and be cardiovascular safe. So when we select drugs for treatment, we have to ensure that these drugs do not have untoward cardiovascular effects, and in fact, it would be preferable if they would improve cardiovascular outcomes. Therefore, the future for diabetes therapy at this moment is for those drugs that have good anti-hyperglycemic effect and also that can reduce cardiovascular effects. So at the moment, we have a lot of anti-hyperglycemic drugs, starting from insulin all the way to SGLT2, to the newer SGLT2 inhibitors. But most of these drugs have not shown any cardiovascular benefit. In fact, some of them have shown deleterious effects to the cardiovascular system. Like, for example, I'm sure you know the rosiglitazone story, which in a meta-analysis, which was shown to have a risk of MI and heart failure. So besides metformin, which appears to be still beneficial, there are very few drugs that are beneficial to the cardiovascular system. So like the recently introduced GLP-1 receptor agonists like liraglutide and SGLT2 inhibitors, so which I will be talking about subsequently. So why should we worry about cardiovascular safety of diabetes medications? I'm sure this gathering knows very well the ACCORD trial, which showed that lowering blood glucose level increases mortality. And also the one that I alluded to earlier about rosiglitazone, we showed improvement in glycemic control, but an increase in myocardial events. Therefore, when we bring down blood sugar, it's important which drug to use and how low we lower it. Based on these studies, the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicine Agency have now issued guidance on newer anti-diabetic agents that these new diabetic agents must have a cardiovascular safety trials and, if possible, improve outcomes. And after the issuance of this guidance, there have been a large number of cardiovascular trials of the newer anti-diabetic agents. And this is the well-known empagliflozin study, EMPAREG, the leader trial of liraglutide, examine allogliptin, savortimi 53 of saxagliptin, TECOS of sitagliptin, and we have also ELIXA trial, SUSTAIN 6 trial, which have been completed. So nowadays, any new diabetic drug should have a cardiovascular safety trial. We have been hoping the newer DPP-4 inhibitors would have a cardiovascular safety because of their profile, but unfortunately, they have not been shown to improve cardiovascular outcomes. They have been found to be neutral, but in fact, some of them had a non-significant increase in congestive heart failure. Otherwise, they don't have any other untoward effects. The leader trial, which studied the GLP-1 receptor agonist liraglutide, has been shown to improve cardiovascular outcomes, cardiovascular deaths or deaths from any cause, as you can see on this slide, because it improves all cardiovascular outcomes. Now, the newer SGLT2 inhibitors, we have 4 of them at the moment: canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, empagliflozin, and ipragliflozin, mostly in Japan, the ipragliflozin. And this, particularly the 3 of them, canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, and empagliflozin, have been studied. And you know the beneficial effects of SGLT2 inhibitors. They improve glycemic control, promote weight loss, reduce blood pressure, and in fact they have a very insulin-sparing effect, and they can be combined with any other anti-diabetic agents, and they are less risk in terms of hypoglycemia. Now, among the newer SGLT2 inhibitors, the ones that have been studied very well are the dapagliflozin, that has been in the market for some time, and canagliflozin and empagliflozin to a certain extent. And these trials have shown that, for example, dapagliflozin reduces glucose, improves weight, and reduces blood pressure. And there have been also recently conducted meta-analysis on dapagliflozin and on canagliflozin and empagliflozin, and these meta-analyses have shown the beneficial effect of SGLT2 inhibitors. And these clinical trial findings have been shown to be true in real clinical scenario, as I will be showing you shortly. And there is, of course, this the CVD real studies, the DAPA-CV real-world evidence studies that also concurred with the clinical trials. And of course, there is also an ongoing dapagliflozin trial to look at the various diabetic patients, whether it is going to have favorable cardiovascular outcomes in a prospective study. And there is also an ongoing study on DAPA, heart failure, DAPA, CKD. So this slide to your right is a randomized clinical trial which showed beneficial effect in terms of reduction of blood sugar, weight, blood pressure, either as monotherapy or in combination with other agents. And this has been also confirmed in real clinical practice that have been done recently in the UK, Sweden, and many other countries. And I just want to share with you the latest study on this SGLT2 inhibitors, the CVD real study, which is a multi-country observational study using real-world clinical practice, not the usual clinical trials. So this was from records from 6 countries, US and European countries, and this is actually the first large and multinational retrospective observational study evaluating hospitalization for heart failure and all-cause deaths in patients with type 2 diabetes who are put newly on SGLT2 inhibitors or another oral glucose-lowering drugs. So the majority of these patients did not have a history of CVD, unlike, for example, the empagliflozin study. So, and therefore, this would really add to our knowledge of improving cardiovascular outcomes with minimal or low risk for cardiovascular disease. So, in fact, they looked at hospitalization for heart failure as primary outcome, and of course, all-cause deaths and heart failure and all-cause deaths also were studied as secondary endpoints. In fact, the group who received SGLT2 inhibitor and those who received other drugs were quite comparable in terms of demography, in terms of cardiovascular disease and chronic complications, and in terms of anti-hyperglycemic agents and diabetic agents and statins. So, as you can see on this slide, in the US, they use more of canagliflozin, which accounted for about 75% of use, and in the European countries, the majority of patients were on dapagliflozin, 92%, very small with empagliflozin. In fact, canagliflozin seems to be not prescribed in many European countries. So, what this study showed is that irrespective of which SGLT2 inhibitor you use, they have all favorable outcome in terms of hospitalization for heart failure, which is, as I said, a major manifestation of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And all-cause death, also primary analysis shows favorable outcome in terms of SGLT2 inhibitors. It doesn't matter which SGLT2 inhibitors one would use. And there is also another study from the UK, the Health Improvement Network database, which looked at patients in 640 general practices, and this study also had confirmed earlier findings in which those patients exposed to DAPA and unexposed to DAPA had more or less similar baseline characteristics, but what it showed is that patients with type 2 diabetes who were administered dapagliflozin had lower all-cause mortality compared with matched controls under standard treatment. So this study, the UK Think database study, showed that patients who were exposed to dapagliflozin had a lower all-cause mortality, as you can see in the slide. Now, just a few words about the EMPA-REG outcome on cardiovascular death. This is the first time any diabetic drug had shown benefit in terms of mortality from cardiovascular disease. All other drugs never showed any benefit or any reduction of mortality. So this is what we are trying. So many people will be surviving on this drug. That's what it will. So a 38% reduction in cardiovascular death, 35% reduction in hospitalization for heart failure, and a 34% reduction of hospitalization for heart failure or cardiovascular death. And of course, 39% reduction hospitalization or death from heart failure as well. Now, empagliflozin has also shown favorable outcomes in terms of renal outcomes. As you can see on this slide, incident or worsening nephropathy was less on patients with empagliflozin, and doubling of the serum creatinine was also less on in patients with empagliflozin. Now, in summary, what these studies have shown is that empagliflozin has demonstrated cardiovascular risk reduction in patients with established cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. Now, the other drugs that are ongoing, like the DECLARE study, is looking at not only established cardiovascular risk factors, but lower risk for cardiovascular disease. So that will widen our understanding. So now the outcome of the DECLARE study or the CANVAS study will really widen our understanding of reduction of cardiovascular risk factors. So the EMPA-REG had already been completed, as you can see on this. Now the two studies that are ongoing are the CANVAS study and the DECLARE study, which are looking at a huge population of diabetics. In fact, once they are completed, they will really change the way we are managing type 2 diabetes. In fact, even now we should start looking at how we are managing type 2 diabetes. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that type 2 diabetes is associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease and has a particular risk for heart failure. Intensive glycemic control in advanced stage of disease, like the accord, like patients, does not seem to decrease cardiovascular events. In fact, it may be harmful through inducing hypoglycemia. So this hypoglycemia really may offset benefits of intensive glucose lowering. So glycemic control early in the course of diabetes with multifactorial approach, blood pressure, or weight, lipids, has benefit in decreasing major adverse cardiovascular events. The recently completed large cardiovascular safety trials and the ones that are ongoing with SGLT2 inhibitors and with GLP-1 receptor agonists showed significant reduction of elevated glucose and cardiovascular risk, which we are looking for. We are looking for the ideal anti-hyperglycemic agent that lowers blood pressure, that lowers weight, that lowers glycemia, and at the same time that has favorable cardiovascular profile and improves cardiovascular outcomes. Therefore, based on this latest data, we have to personalize treatment of hyperglycemia in our patients, and the risk versus benefit of all glucose-lowering agents for each individual patient should be evaluated. And I am sure with these new data that are coming, there should be a need for change of guidelines on how to approach type 2 diabetes patients with cardiovascular risk factors. I know you will be asking the cost issues and so on, but you know, treatment of diabetes is like an investment. Now you invest a little more now, and then you gain the benefits later on. Because once they develop complications, our patients will be spending more and more. So that is what we have to think about. Asante sana.
Because Professor Reja has to travel, we will take questions now from him before we go to the next talk. So probably I'll allow 3 questions in the interest of time. Any questions? Questions? As we're waiting for questions, maybe I can ask one? As the chair. Okay. There have been some concerns about amputation with one of the, I don't know if it's a group effect or a particular effect, with canagliflozin, but there were 3 amputations in the placebo group and 6 with the particular drug, and there were more patients in that in that study compared to EMPA. So do you have anything to contribute? Because you know, whenever something like that comes up, it's like the rosiglitazone story. Eventually it was cleared, but then the harm had been done. So I think that's something that's concerning all of us in the diabetes world. The risk of amputations with the SGLT2 inhibitors.
Yeah, I mean, these SGLT2 inhibitors are relatively new. So it is going to be seen in the next few years whether they have long-term sustainable effect and favorable outcomes. But we have to watch on these untoward effects.
Paul, can you give the mic, please?
Thanks, Ahmed. Do you have any insights into the modality, the mode of action of how these new drugs improve heart disease or heart failure so fast? Considering there's been all these discussions, whether it's the diuretic effect, internal cellular metabolism or myocardium. Is there any clarity in this issue?
I think now the benefit of these drugs has come very early in the course of the trials, very early. So it is not ascribable to just reduction of blood glucose levels. Now, we know EMPA has reduced cardiovascular mortality and hospitalization for heart failure. So most probably this has to do with its diuretic effect because there is diuresis, improving vasculature in the patients. But the upcoming studies with DECLARE and CANVAS will tell us whether this is a class effect of SGLT2 inhibitors. If this is a class effect, then it's probably due to diuresis and improving vasculature and so on. But if it's only for empagliflozin, then we'll have to study what is particular about empagliflozin in terms of improving cardiovascular outcomes. But this has been conclusively shown that they improve early. The separation in the curves, as you have seen, is very early in the introduction of the drug. So this has to do with some diuretic effect or improvement in vasculature.
Thank you. One more question. One more question, last question, anybody?
Yeah.
Sorry, the light is straight in my eye. I think whoever is asking can. Yes. Dr. Baraz?
Sorry, it's a follow-up question of the SGLT2 antagonist. If it's the diuretic effect, what about all the other diuretic drugs we have in heart failure that are not working, like Lasix?
I know that was coming, but that is one postulate that is being said about these newer drugs. But beyond the diuresis, they have also other effects that we have to look at because they have shown improvement, and we have been using other diuretics, but they don't improve cardiovascular outcomes. So these drugs really need further studies to look at why they are improving or reducing cardiovascular outcomes.
Do you want to?
I just wanted to follow up that on the cardiology side, we're just as baffled as well. And I think it was a trial of serendipity a bit more than anything, and it's like kind of working backwards. So I'm very interested to hear what you think about using the drug in non-diabetic patients.
Now, SGLT2 inhibitors are used in, the indications are for using in type 2 diabetes, but there are now ongoing trials even to use them in type 1 diabetes, but that has, we have to wait for the outcome studies. The use of SGLT2 inhibitors in diabetics has not been looked at, and they are not at the moment recommended either as weight loss agents or as antihypertensive, no.
But there are some also indications in, they are also being tried in fatty liver and insulin resistant states and polycystic ovaries, just as the GLP-1 analogs are. So I think there's a whole Pandora of possible indications for the newer agents. I think only time will tell. So we wait and see. But one thing you must tell your patients is the sanitation. There's an increased chance of genital and urinary infections. So your patients on the SGLT2 inhibitors have to drink more water and sanitation, washing with water or wiping. I think in certain cultures they did not find the increased infections like the Japanese or the Middle East cultures, and it had to do with genital hygiene, sanitation. So I think those are just practical points you must tell your patients when you put them on these agents. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely true. I didn't go into the details of the side effects and so on because the main focus was on cardiovascular safety. But when you use SGLT2 inhibitors, make sure that you have baseline electrolytes, make sure that they are not hypotensive, make sure that their renal function is good, and of course the genital hygiene is extremely important.
Thank you very much. There's one more hand. Can I allow? He's really been just very quick.
Oh, thanks. You intimated that the guidelines would change in view of this evidence. Can you just sort of elaborate on that and say, you know, should we be reaching for a glyphosate before we reach for a sulfonyl or urea? Is there enough evidence at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, currently the first treatment for type 2 diabetes undoubtedly metformin. Now, there are a lot of controversies what to give next after metformin. What's the best drug after metformin? I mean, the current guidelines tell you that you can use any other drug like sulfonylureas, TZDs, DPP-4 inhibitors, SGLT2 inhibitors, GLP-1 receptor agonists, or insulin. But now, with those results, if somebody has already an established cardiovascular disease, it will be important to use those drugs that have favorable outcome like SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 receptor agonists. Of course, here's the issue is about cost and availability in many countries. But as I said, cost is a relative issue. Either you pay now a little bit more or you pay more later on. So maybe some doctors nowadays, when they have patients with established cardiovascular disease, after metformin, they put them on SGLT2 inhibitors.
Dr. Ahmed Reja, it's always a pleasure to listen to you and to have you here in Kenya.
Thank you.
Asante sana. Can we applaud him?